If you think being born into royalty was the ultimate blessing, a life of jewels, palaces, and servants at your command, I think again. Because beneath the velvet curtains and gilded ceilings lurked something far darker than political intrigue or battlefield defeat. For centuries, Europe's kings and queens clung to the belief that their blood was too precious to be diluted, that marrying cousins or even siblings was a sacred duty to keep dynasties pure and thrones secure. On the surface, it sounded logical. Keep the fortune within the family, prevent rival claims, and preserve a holy lineage said to be chosen by God. Yet what they did not know, or perhaps what they chose to ignore, was that this very obsession planted seeds of weakness that would grow into deformities, madness, and entire dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own genetic mistakes. Picture this: a wedding feast inside a candlelit palace where everyone in attendance carries the same family name. Glasses clink, musicians play, and courtiers whisper praises about the brilliance of the royal bloodline. But behind the scenes, doctors already note strange illnesses in newborn heirs. Priests whisper prayers over children who cannot walk or speak. And portraits of once proud rulers begin to show the same crooked jaw or vacant stare. Modern science calls it genetic mutation. At the time, it was interpreted as divine punishment, or simply fate. And as history would prove, fate was merciless. What unfolded was not just a story of individuals, but of dynasties undone by their own pride. The Habsburgs, once among the most powerful houses in Europe, ended their reign with a king, so inbred he could hardly chew his food or produce an heir. The Tudors and Bourbons looked on with fear, knowing the same shadows might haunt them. Even beyond Europe, in Egypt, Hawaii, and Siam, royal families repeated the same pattern, turning their bloodlines into cages rather than crowns. So tonight, as you lean back and let the hum of the night settle around you, I will guide you through 16 stories, 16 rulers and royals, whose lives remind us that power cannot buy health, that crowns can weigh heavier than flesh, and that the obsession with purity often breeds only decay. From Charles II of Spain with his infamous Habsburg jaw, to Cleopatra, whose real face looked nothing like the seductress of legend, to Nero and Caligula, emperors lost to madness. Each tale shows us how fragile even the mightiest empires were when their foundations rested on blood that was slowly betraying them. For centuries, the name Habsburg carried a weight that few families in Europe could rival. From Austria to Spain, from the Holy Roman Empire to the Netherlands, their reach was so vast that one could almost believe the sun itself never set on their dominions. Their motto, often repeated with pride, was simple yet chilling. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, shall marry, and marry they did cousins with cousins, uncles with nieces, generation after generation, until the family tree no longer branched outward, but curled in on itself like a snake devouring its own tail. What began as a clever political strategy soon morphed into a genetic trap from which the dynasty could not escape. The most visible mark of this legacy was what historians later called the Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw, so exaggerated it disfigured portraits, made chewing almost impossible, and turned speech into a laborious task. At first, courtiers pretended it was merely a family trait, an eccentric quirk of appearance, like a crooked smile or a striking nose. But as the centuries passed, the deformity grew more severe, paired with other signs of inbreeding frailty, infertility, Zeitzures, and mental instability. By the 17th century, whispers in palace corridors had become impossible to ignore. The most powerful dynasty in Europe was rotting from within, undone, not by invading armies, but by the marriages it had orchestrated in the name of purity. No figure embodies this decline more tragically than Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king of his line. Born in 1661, Charles entered the world already burdened by centuries of genetic entanglement. His inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how closely related his parents were, was higher than if they had been siblings. From childhood, he struggled with developmental delays. He could not walk until the age of 8. And even then his gait was unsteady. He could not chew his food properly because his jaw jutted so grotesquely forward, and his tongue was so large that speech came out slurred, almost incomprehensible. Courtier described him as drooling constantly, with vacant eyes that seemed lost in another world. Yet this fragile boy was expected to sit upon one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. The irony was cruel. While Charles wore the crown of Spain, he had little of the strength or charisma his ancestors once wielded. Twice married, he was unable to produce an heir, a failure that cast a long shadow over the future of his dynasty. Diplomats across Europe speculated anxiously, for the childless king meant one thing when he died. The vast Habsburg Empire would be up for grabs, likely plunging the continent into war. And indeed, when Charles passed away in 1700 at only 39 years old, thin, sickly, and utterly broken, his death set off the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that engulfed nearly every great power of Europe. The curse of the Habsburgs had not only destroyed a man, it had destabilized an entire continent. But Charles was not alone in carrying the burden of this bloodline. His ancestor Joanna of Castile, remembered by history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, was another tragic figure caught in the spiral of inheritance. Intelligent and passionate in youth, she married Philip, the handsome of Habsburg, himself already the product of cousin marriages. But Philip was a notorious philanderer, and Joanna's obsessive love for him tipped into madness. When he died suddenly in the early 16th century, Joanna clung to his corpse, reportedly sleeping beside the embalmed body night after night, unwilling to let go. Was this the act of a woman undone by grief? Or was it the manifestation of genetic instability passed down by generations of intermarriage? Historians still debate. But what is clear is that her descendants inherited not only her crown, but her curse. Even in later centuries, the shadow lingered. Ferdinand I of Austria, a descendant of Joanna, was born in 1793 with hydrocephaly, water on the brain which left him with seizures, cognitive impairment, and the same notorious jaw. Though he was technically king of Hungary, Bohemia, and Lombardy Venetia, the real governance of the empire fell to regents and advisors, while Ferdinand spent his days rolling around the palace in a wastepaper basket, one of his peculiar amusements. He reigned for 18 years but contributed little to the state beyond his mere presence on the throne, a reminder that the dynasty was now more symbol than substance. When you look across portraits of the Habsburg line, you notice a strange consistency. Faces that should have been unique instead blur together, each jawline jutting farther forward, each mouth drooping open. It is as if the dynasty painted itself into a genetic corner, every brushstroke emphasizing the same flaw until the image became grotesque. Modern geneticists have confirmed what courtiers only whispered centuries ago: inbreeding had stripped the Habsburgs of vitality, leaving them vulnerable to disease, infertility, and collapse. And so, the family that once prided itself on strategic marriages became the very cautionary tale of why bloodlines are meant to branch outward. Their story reminds us that power cannot shield anyone from the laws of biology. The mightiest empire in Europe, a dynasty that claimed crowns from Madrid to Vienna, was toppled not by armies or revolutions, but by the silent erosion of its own DNA. If the Habsburgs became the eternal warning about inbreeding, Then Queen Victoria of Britain became the unwitting messenger of a single genetic flaw that rippled across continents and toppled empires. To the outside world, Victoria was the grandmother of Europe, a matriarch whose children and grandchildren sat on the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, Spain, Greece, and beyond. She represented stability, a monarch whose reign stretched longer than any before her. Yet hidden in her bloodline was a mutation, a disorder that would come to be called the royal disease, and with every marriage she arranged, that flaw spread like an invisible poison. The disease was haemophilia, a condition where the blood does not clot properly. A small cut could become life-threatening. A bruise could swell uncontrollably, and internal bleeding could strike without warning. Victoria herself did not suffer severely, which perhaps explains why she did not recognize the danger, but her descendants paid the price. Her daughter Alice carried the mutation into the German and Russian courts. From there, it passed to Alice's daughter Alexandra, who became Tsarina of Russia, the wife of Nicholas II, and mother of a frail boy named Alexei. Alexei Romanov's story is perhaps the most infamous chapter in the saga of haemophilia. Born in 1904, the boy was heir to the Russian throne. Yet his body betrayed him from the beginning. He bruised easily, bled endlessly from minor injuries, and lived under constant threat of death. His desperate mother turned to a strange figure for help, Grigory Rasputin, a wandering mystic whose hypnotic gaze and whispered prayers seemed, at times, to ease the child's suffering. Rasputin's influence grew so immense that it shook the Russian monarchy to its core. Ministers, generals, and even the Tsar himself deferred to him, because he alone appeared capable of soothing the boy's agony. To the Russian people, however, Rasputin became a symbol of corruption, lust, and the decay of the royal family. It was as if the haemophilia gene had not only weakened Alexei's body, but also infected the empire with chaos. But Russia was not the only realm affected. Other branches of Victoria's sprawling family tree also carried the disease. In Spain, Prince Alfonso, the heir to the throne, died in his early 30s after a minor car accident left him bleeding uncontrollably. In Germany and Britain, young princes succumbed before reaching adulthood, their deaths cloaked in silence, but mourned deeply behind palace doors. The royal disease seemed to mock the very idea of dynastic strength. These were families that commanded armies, ruled nations, and shaped history. Yet they could not protect their own children from bleeding to death after a stumble on the palace steps. Historians still argue about how haemophilia altered the course of nations, but few deny its profound impact. Without Alexei's illness, Rasputin might never have risen to power. The Russian monarchy might not have been so fatally discredited, and perhaps the revolution of 1917 might have taken a different path. Without the deaths of heirs across Europe, succession crises might not have fractured thrones and shifted alliances. A single mutation in Queen Victoria's blood became a thread pulled loose from the fabric of Europe, unraveling dynasties one by one. When you trace the portraits of Victoria's descendants, you see smiling faces, regal uniforms, glittering tiaras. Yet behind those painted eyes lies a secret, a body that could betray them at any moment. The royal disease was more than a medical condition. It was a reminder that crowns and palaces cannot alter the rules of biology. The same fragile thread that holds ordinary families together also bound the most powerful royals. And for Victoria's descendants, that thread was stained red. There is a peculiar cruelty in history when the body fails. People mourn. When the mind fails, people whisper. A king who limps or stammers may still command respect. But a monarch whose thoughts unravel is quickly branded as mad, cursed, or even dangerous. Power magnifies everything, brilliance becomes genius, and weakness becomes scandal. And so, when mental illness stalked the halls of Europe's palaces, it did not simply destroy individuals, it shook empires, toppled governments, and scarred the way generations remembered their rulers. This part of our journey carries us into the shadowy corridors where crowns sat heavy upon troubled minds. George III of Britain, Maria I of Portugal, Elizabeth of Austria, and Ludwig II of Bavaria, four rulers, different in temperament and destiny, yet bound together by the haunting reminder that the crown, more often than not, consumes those who wear it. George III, the Mad King who lost America. Imagine the grand halls of London in the late 18th century, bustling with advisors, soldiers, and merchants, each hanging on the words of the monarch who commanded the world's most formidable empire. King George III, born in 1738, was not expected to be extraordinary. He was diligent, serious, and, unlike many of his Hanoverian ancestors, spoke English as his first language. For years, he fulfilled his duties faithfully, guiding Britain through wars, managing Parliament, and presenting himself as a devoted husband and father. To the public, he was the model of stability. And yet, behind closed doors, cracks began to appear. George's letters, once clear and measured, grew longer and more chaotic. Sentences stretched to hundreds of words, filled with erratic punctuation and strange digressions. Courtiers whispered that he talked incessantly, his mouth foaming as though the words themselves were consuming him. Physicians struggled to understand what plagued their king. Some suspected porphyria, a rare genetic disease that can cause episodes of pain, delirium, and purple-tinted urine. Others believe, with modern hindsight, that he suffered from bipolar disorder, manic highs that left him overflowing with energy, followed by crushing lows of despair. The consequences were catastrophic. During his reign, the American colonies declared independence, and Britain's attempt to suppress the rebellion collapsed into humiliation. To his critics, the king's mental instability symbolized the decay of British power. Pamphlets mocked him as mad. Satirists turned his ramblings into jokes. And across the Atlantic, revolutionaries painted him as the tyrant who had lost his mind. Treatment in the 18th century was little better than torture. George was confined in straitjackets, forced into ice baths, and subjected to painful blistering on his skin, as though physical suffering might shock his mind back into order. For long periods, he disappeared from public life entirely, hidden away while regents governed in his place. To his children, he was a ghost of the man they once knew. To his people, he became a living legend of madness, pitied by some, despised by others, but never forgotten. Maria I, the queen who howled at night far to the south. In Portugal, another monarch carried the same burden. Maria I, born in 1734, was remembered by two names: Maria the Pious, for her deep devotion to faith, and Maria the Mad, for the shadows that consumed her mind. As a child, Maria was bright, devout, and serious. Her education was steeped in religion, and she often prayed for hours. To her family, this seemed admirable, even saintly. Yet, beneath the surface, there were signs of imbalance, bouts of melancholy, sudden outbursts, and an almost obsessive fear of sin. In a cruel twist of dynastic tradition, Maria was married to her own uncle, Peter III, a union that reinforced the inbreeding already present in the Portuguese royal line. For a time, she managed her duties as queen with dignity, But in the 1790s, tragedy struck. Her confessor, the priest who had guided her spiritual life, died suddenly. Maria, already fragile, was devastated. She began to scream in grief, wailing with animal-like cries that echoed through the palace. Servants reported that she roamed the halls at night, shrieking at unseen visions, convinced she was damned. Foreign observers were horrified. The Queen of Portugal, once a symbol of piety, was now a figure of public shame. Doctors were summoned from across Europe, including Francis Willis, the same physician who had treated George III. His methods were harsh ice baths, bloodletting, laxatives, blistering of the skin. None of it helped. By 1792, Maria was declared incapable of ruling. Her son, Prince João, assumed power as regent, but even he was touched by the family's curse, genetically frail, indecisive, and plagued by his own difficulties. When Napoleon's armies advanced on Portugal, João fled with his mother and the royal court to Brazil. There, in the humid heat of Rio de Janeiro, Maria lived out her final years. A broken queen, surrounded by foreign lands. She died in 1816, remembered not for her governance, but for the chilling image of a monarch howling in despair. Elizabeth of Austria, the Empress of Sorrows, while George and Maria embodied the spectacle of royal madness. Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, revealed another face of mental torment: depression, anorexia, and the suffocating loneliness of imperial life. Born in 1837 into the Wittelsbach family, Elizabeth was beautiful, dreamy, and spirited. At 16, she married Emperor Franz Joseph, and the fairy tale image of their union dazzled Europe. Yet life at the Viennese court proved suffocating. Elizabeth was scrutinized by her formidable mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, criticized for her shyness, and forced into rigid routines of etiquette. Slowly, her free spirit wilted. Her response was extreme control over her own body. Elizabeth ate little, sometimes surviving on little more than broth and oranges. She weighed herself obsessively and exercised for hours each day, walking, riding, or fencing until exhaustion. Historians today suspect she suffered from anorexia nervosa. Long before the condition had a name, she was admired for her slim figure. But behind the admiration lay pain. Depression shadowed her constantly. She wrote melancholy poems, spoke of longing for death, and fled the court whenever she could, traveling restlessly across Europe and the Mediterranean. Her son Rudolf inherited her fragility, and in 1899 he took his own life in the tragic Merling incident, leaving Elizabeth shattered. Her end came abruptly in 1898, when an Italian anarchist stabbed her with a sharpened file while she walked along Lake Geneva. She collapsed, whispering, "What has happened to me?" For many, her death seemed the final act of a life already consumed by sorrow. Elizabeth remains one of history's most haunting figures, a woman trapped between the image of imperial beauty and the reality of profound despair. Ludwig II, the king who built dreams and lost his mind if Elizabeth embodied sorrow. Her cousin Ludwig II of Bavaria embodied fantasy. Born in 1845, Ludwig ascended to the throne at 18 years old. A young man with romantic ideals and little political experience, from the beginning, he was enchanted by art, music, and beauty, preferring the company of poets and composers to politicians. His obsession with Richard Wagner, the composer of sweeping operas, consumed him. Ludwig poured vast sums into Wagner's projects, building theatres and sponsoring productions. But his true passion was architecture. He envisioned palaces that seemed torn from fairy tales. Neuschwanstein, with its soaring turrets perched on alpine cliffs, and Linderhof, a miniature Versailles adorned with gilded halls. These castles, now among Germany's most beloved landmarks, were seen in his time as symbols of waste and delusion. As the years passed, Ludwig withdrew further into his fantasies. He dined alone at tables set for dozens, spoke to imagined companions, and wandered his castles at night, while the government struggled under the weight of his spending. Ministers grew alarmed. Beaten Eitusix. They declared him insane and unfit to rule. Days later, Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg alongside his physician. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but suspicion lingers. Was the Mad King murdered to remove him quietly? Historians still debate, but the image remains unforgettable, an artist king who dreamed of beauty yet drowned in mystery. The common thread, minds shattered by crowns George, Maria, Elisabeth, Ludwig. Their stories differ in detail, but echo with the same refrain. The weight of the crown amplified their frailties, turned illness into legend, and made private suffering into public spectacle. Some were mocked, others pitied, but all became prisoners of their own minds, watched by a world that demanded strength from them, but offered no mercy when they faltered. Together, they remind us that mental illness is not weakness, but humanity, and that no amount of power or prestige can guard against it. The palaces where they once lived now stand as monuments for tourists, glittering with chandeliers and painted ceilings. Yet if you walk through their halls in silence, you might imagine faint echoes, George rambling until his words dissolved into nonsense, Maria howling through the night, Elizabeth pacing restlessly with hollow eyes, Ludwig sketching castles no treasury could sustain. These are not just legends, they are the shadows of lives where the crown devoured the mind. Long before Europe's monarchs tangled their family trees into a web of cousins and nieces, the pharaohs of Egypt had already written the tragic script of dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own blood. In a land where kings were worshipped as gods, where the Nile's steady rhythm promised eternal life, the rulers of the Nile believed they could secure divinity by keeping their line pure. To marry outside the family would dilute the sacred blood of Horus. To marry a sibling was to ensure that the god's power remained intact. It was a belief as intoxicating as it was fatal. If Europe remembered the Habsburg jaw, Egypt remembered the elongated skulls of its rulers. If Europe whispered about madness in the courts of George III or Maria I, Egypt whispered about frail boy kings who limped instead of marching in chariots. The idea was the same across centuries and continents in the pursuit of divine purity. Royal families imprisoned themselves in bodies destined for suffering. Tutankhamun, the boy who could not run. In modern imagination, Tutankhamun, King Tut, is often remembered as the golden boy of Egypt, the youthful ruler whose tomb dazzled the 20th century with treasures of unimaginable wealth. His golden mask, serene and majestic, stares out from museum displays as if he were the picture of health and vitality. But the truth buried beneath the desert sands told a different story, one unearthed, not by archaeologists' brushes, but by CT scans and DNA analysis. Tutankhamun was born around 1341 before Christ, the son of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who tried to replace Egypt's gods with the worship of the sun disk. For generations, the royal family had married brother to sister, aunt to nephew, repeating the cycle of divine unions that priests proclaimed necessary. By the time Tutankhamun entered the world, his lineage was so entangled that his body bore the scars of centuries of incest. He had a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and an elongated skull. The latter once believed to be the result of artificial shaping, but now known to be congenital. Far from the image of a boy king racing down the Nile in a chariot, Tutankhamun likely walked with a cane, several of which were found in his tomb, worn from use. His bones revealed evidence of necrosis in his foot, while DNA showed repeated infections of malaria. He was not a warrior or a mighty builder, but a fragile teenager struggling simply to survive. And yet, as tragic as his condition was, the mistakes of his family continued. Tutankhamun married his half-sister, Tutankhamun, daughter of Akhenaten, and the infamous Nefertiti. Their union produced no surviving children. 2 fetuses, stillborn, were buried with him. Silent testimony to the deadly legacy of inbreeding. When Tutankhamun died around the age of 19, his dynasty died with him, leaving Egypt vulnerable to power struggles that would echo long after his golden coffin was sealed. The irony is striking: his death might have passed into obscurity. One more frail king, forgotten by history. Had his tomb not been discovered intact in 1922 by Howard Carter. Instead, his broken body became immortalized, a reminder to the modern world that divine blood often carried mortal flaws. The glittering mask conceals, not majesty but fragility. A king so weak he needed walking sticks. A god on earth, undone by his own DNA. Cleopatra, the seductress who was not beautiful. If Tutankhamun embodies fragility, Cleopatra embodies myth. For centuries, she has been cast as the ultimate femme fatale, the queen who seduced Julius Caesar, bewitched Mark Antony, and nearly brought Rome to its knees. Hollywood sealed this image with Elizabeth Taylor's kohl-rimmed eyes and violet gowns, cementing Cleopatra as the most beautiful woman of the ancient world. But history, as always, tells a harsher truth. Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was not Egyptian by blood, but Macedonian Greek, descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies clung to their throne in Egypt by a ruthless formula: marry siblings, preserve the dynasty, and guard their power against outsiders. Kings wed their sisters as a matter of law, not choice. Cleopatra herself, at Octaeon, married her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII. When he died, she married her other brother, Ptolemy XIV. The pattern was as relentless as it was destructive. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cleopatra's features were far from the symmetrical beauty of modern imagination. Coins minted with her likeness show a hooked nose, a rounded face, and a heavy chin. In addition, researchers have argued that the dynasty's long history of sibling marriages likely contributed to obesity among its rulers. Mummies of other Ptolemaic elites show signs of weight gain, heart disease, and diabetes conditions fed both by diet and genetics. Cleopatra, it seems, was more likely overweight than ethereally slim. Roman propagandists amplified the contrast, portraying her not as beautiful but as cunning, seductive by intellect and charisma rather than physical perfection. The irony is that Cleopatra's true power lay not in her face but in her mind. Fluent in multiple languages, versed in politics, and shrewd in diplomacy, she played the game of empire with skill. But even her brilliance could not save her dynasty from the curse of inbreeding. Her children with Caesar and Antony were swept aside in the Roman conquest. And with Cleopatra's death in 30 before Christ, the Ptolemaic line ended. Once again, the obsession with pure blood left behind only graves and legends. Beyond Egypt, the global pattern, though Tutankhamun and Cleopatra are the most famous. Egypt was not alone in this cycle. Across oceans and centuries, the same mistakes were repeated. In the Hawaiian Islands of the early 19th century, Princess Nahi-Ena-Ena fell in love with her brother, King Kamehameha III. Raised in the old traditions that celebrated sibling unions as divine, she married him despite the disapproval of Protestant missionaries who had converted much of the population. But when she became pregnant, the child died hours after birth, likely the result of generations of inbreeding weakening the royal line. Shunned by her people and abandoned by the church, Nahi-Ena-Ena died young, remembered as both a victim of love and of tradition. In Siam, modern Thailand King Chulalongkorn, Rama V, modernized his country, abolished slavery, and fought off colonial powers. Yet even he, a reformer by reputation, filled his harem with cousins and relatives, fathering 77 children with more than 100 wives. His reign looked outward, but his private life repeated the same inward spiral of dynastic unions. The logic was always the same: to keep power close, to prevent outsiders from seizing control. And the result was also the same: frail children, sickly heirs, and dynasties burdened with genetic weakness. Rome, madness in the empire of emperors. As Europe later discovered, the Roman emperors too were not immune to the lure of dynastic marriages. Nero, born of a union between uncle and niece, became the most infamous tyrant of the empire, his paranoia and cruelty fiddling while Rome burned. Murdering his own mother and executing rivals have often been blamed on lead poisoning from pipes and wine. But modern historians also point to the genetic tangle of his family, where incest was as much a tool of politics as conquest. Caligula, descended from the same twisted tree, embodied the lunacy of unchecked power, accused of sleeping with his sisters, declaring himself a living god, and building a bridge between his palace and the temple of Jupiter so he could walk among the deities. He turned Rome into a theatre of madness. His assassination, after just 4 years, was as brutal as his reign, stabbed 30 times by his own guards, from the Nile to the Tiber. The pattern held: purity of blood meant impurity of body and mind. Dynasties that worshipped their lineage condemned themselves to fragility. Their crowns weighed down, not by gold, but by genes. The lesson of ancient blood. When we step back and trace these lives, Tutankhamun limping with his cane, Cleopatra cloaked in propaganda, Nahi-Ena-Ena shunned by her own people, Rama V hiding his incestuous harem, Nero raving, Caligula bleeding out, we see not separate stories, but one continuous theme. The obsession with purity was, in truth, an obsession with control. And control, when absolute, always turns inward, consuming those who cling to it. The gods were supposed to bless the pharaohs with eternity. Instead, their children died in infancy. Rome was supposed to last forever. Yet madness rotted it from the throne downward, even in distant Hawaii or Siam. The same lesson whispered: bloodlines cannot be imprisoned without consequence. Modern science gives us the language of genetics, of recessive traits and mutations. But centuries ago, people called it fate, curse, or divine judgment. Perhaps that is why these stories linger so powerfully. They remind us that behind the masks of gold and the portraits of power were fragile human beings, bound by biology no less than any peasant or servant. So, when you picture Tutankhamun's mask glinting under museum lights, remember the boy who leaned on a cane, coughing from malaria. When you imagine Cleopatra reclining in her palace, remember the heavy chin, the body shaped not by beauty, but by centuries of inbreeding. And when you recall Nero or Caligula, remember that their madness was not only political but biological. A crown passed through generations until it crushed the very heads it adorned. The idea of monarchy often conjures images of power without limits, palaces glistening with chandeliers, armies saluting in perfect rows, crowds bowing at the mere appearance of a king or queen. Yet the truth, when examined closely, is far darker. For many rulers, the throne was not a seat of power but a prison cell. Its golden bars forged not only from politics, but from bloodlines twisted upon themselves, to preserve dynasties, to keep wealth within reach, and to guard sacred traditions. Monarchs around the world locked themselves into cages of their own making. In those cages, their children were born fragile, their minds fractured, and their reigns became tragedies written in flesh. We have already seen this pattern among the Habsburgs of Europe and the pharaohs of Egypt, but the story stretches far beyond Vienna or Cairo. In the islands of the Pacific, in the palaces of Siam, and in the heart of Rome, we find the same haunting echo rulers who believed they were preserving power, only to discover that their crowns weighed heavier than their bodies could endure. Princess Nahiena, the broken heart of Hawaii. In the early 19th century, Hawaii was a kingdom caught between two worlds. On one side stood the traditions of its chiefs and ancestors, practices that bound the islands for centuries. On the other side came foreign missionaries, carrying new faiths, new rules, and new judgments about right and wrong. And caught at the center was a young princess named Nahiena, born in 1803. She was the cherished sister of King Kamehameha III. In the ancient Hawaiian system of alii, the ruling chiefs, marriages between siblings were not taboo, but sacred. They were considered a way to preserve divine manna, the spiritual power that flowed through the royal bloodline. To marry her brother was not, in their eyes, a scandal but an honor, a union that would keep their lineage unbroken and their authority unquestioned. But by the time Nahiena reached maturity, the islands had changed. Protestant missionaries, who arrived from New England, condemned such marriages as sinful and corrupt. They preached against what had once been considered sacred. The people, now heavily influenced by Christian teachings, began to view the princess not as holy but as tainted. Still, love, or perhaps duty, drew her toward her brother. She married him in 1825. Despite the fury of the missionaries and the disapproval of much of her own people, soon she became pregnant. The child was born, but within hours died. A fragile life, extinguished almost as soon as it began. Historians suspect that generations of inbreeding weakened the child's body, though in those days it was seen as divine punishment. The death of the infant destroyed Nahiena. Once adored, she now lived in isolation, shunned by the very society that had once celebrated her. Grief consumed her, until her own health collapsed. She died at only 21. They remembered not as the radiant princess she had been, but as a tragic figure whose loyalty to tradition became her undoing. In her story, the throne was not a gift, but a cage, binding her to customs that clashed fatally with the new world pressing in. She became, in her own lifetime, a symbol of what happens when ancient dynasties refuse to bend, when love and bloodline are twisted together until both shatter. Rama V, a modernizer with an ancient cage, thousands of miles away. In Siam, today's Thailand, another monarch walked the tightrope between tradition and change. King Chulalongkorn, remembered as Rama V, reigned from 1868 until 1910. To many, he was the great modernizer of his land. He abolished slavery, built railways and hospitals, and fended off colonial powers that threatened to carve up Southeast Asia. His reign is still celebrated today as a golden age of independence. Yet within his palace walls, Rama V lived in a world that looked backward rather than forward. Following the customs of his dynasty, he filled his harem with wives, concubines, and consorts, more than 150 women in all. Many of them were his own cousins or close relatives. From these unions came 77 children, a sprawling family tree that wound back upon itself again and again. To the outside world, especially to European leaders, such practices were shameful. Incest, polygamy, and harems clashed with Western ideals of monarchy. Rama knew this. When he travelled abroad, he chose to present himself publicly with only one wife, Queen Sauvabha. To his own people, however, the private truth was no secret. The throne was surrounded by a cage of tradition, one that even a reformer king dared not break. The irony is heavy. Rama V resisted colonization and brought modern medicine to his people. But in his own lineage, he perpetuated the same cycle that had doomed pharaohs and Habsburgs. He left behind not only achievements, but also a tangled web of blood relations, a reminder that even modernizing kings can be prisoners of their dynasties. Nero, the emperor who burned within. When we turn from the Pacific to Rome, the cage becomes darker still. Few emperors are as infamous as Nero, who ruled from 54 until 68 after Christ. He is remembered as the tyrant who fiddled while Rome burned, who murdered his own mother, and who bathed the empire in blood. Yet behind the cruelty lay a story written not only by politics but also by blood. Nero was the son of Agrippina, the younger, and her uncle, Emperor Claudius. The marriage was an act of calculation, uniting branches of the imperial family in order to secure power, but it also meant that Nero's genetic inheritance was already narrowed. His family tree folded onto itself like parchment creased too many times. As emperor, Nero spiraled into paranoia, executed rivals, exiled philosophers, and staged elaborate performances where he insisted that his subjects applaud his singing voice. When fire consumed much of Rome in 64, rumors spread that Nero had ordered it himself in order to clear land for a grand palace. Whether true or not, the suspicion reflected how deeply his people distrusted him. Historians argue that lead poisoning from Roman pipes and cosmetics may have worsened his condition, but the role of inbreeding cannot be ignored. Nero was not merely a tyrant by choice. He was the product of a dynasty that had turned its bloodline into a noose. His reign ended violently, with the Senate declaring him an enemy of the state, abandoned and hunted. Nero took his own life at 30 years old, muttering the words, "What an artist dies in me." His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, proof that even the most powerful empire on earth could not survive when its rulers were devoured from within. Caligula, the god who became a monster. If Nero's madness shocked Rome, the reign of Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, was an even sharper descent into chaos. Ascending the throne in 37 after Christ, Caligula at first appeared promising, the beloved son of Germanicus, adored by soldiers and people alike. But within months, his reign dissolved into horror. Caligula declared himself a living god, demanding temples in his honor. He paraded through the streets in costumes of Jupiter and Venus, confusing divinity with delusion. He is accused of sleeping with his sisters, turning the palace into a carnival of incest, and humiliating senators by forcing them to watch grotesque spectacles. In one infamous act, he ordered a bridge built between his palace and the temple of Jupiter so that he could walk directly into the realm of the gods. What made his tyranny unbearable was its theatricality. Parents were forced to watch the execution of their children. Prisoners were slaughtered in arenas for his amusement. The man who began as a promising ruler became a figure of terror. His every whim, a potential death sentence. Like Nero, Caligula was the product of dynastic obsession. The Julio-Claudian line, already entangled by repeated cousin marriages, produced not stability but volatility. His reign ended in assassination, stabbed 30 times by his own guards after a public event. The same crowd that once adored him cheered his death, eager to erase the god-king who had become their nightmare. The shared cage. From Hawaii's princess to Siam's reformer, from Nero's palace to Caligula's arena, the pattern is unmistakable. Thrones intended to elevate their rulers, instead imprisoned them. The very traditions that claim to preserve power-sibling marriages, cousin unions, harems of relatives, became the chains that destroyed both body and mind. In these stories, we see that the cage was not always visible. For Nahi Ina Ina, it was the invisible bars of tradition and faith, forcing her to marry her brother despite her heart's pain. For Rama V, it was the silent shame of knowing his modern achievements would always be overshadowed by whispers of incest within his palace. For Nero and Caligula, it was the madness of dynasties that fed upon themselves until reason collapsed. The crown, when passed through such cages, became heavier than any jewel could justify. To the world, these rulers were symbols of divine right, destiny, or national pride. To themselves, they were captives trapped in cages, built of tradition, fear, and the unrelenting pursuit of bloodline purity. When we look back at these lives, it is tempting to laugh at their excesses, to dismiss Nero as a madman or Caligula as a monster. But beneath the spectacle lies a sobering truth. These rulers were human, their flaws amplified not only by power, but by the choices of generations before them. The cages they inherited were not of their own making, yet they bore the cost. So, the next time you see the gleaming palaces of Europe, the ruins of Rome, or the golden mask of Tutankhamun, and remember the stories behind them. Remember the cages that crowns created, and remember that in the end, no dynasty, however powerful, could escape the simple truth. Bloodlines must breathe, or they will suffocate the very people they were meant to protect. History, when laid bare, is less a string of battles and dates than a long mirror reflecting the choices of those who believed themselves invincible. And perhaps nowhere is that mirror more unflinching than in the stories of kings and queens undone, not by assassins' daggers or foreign armies, but by their own blood. From the gilded palaces of Vienna to the deserts of Egypt, from the volcanic shores of Hawaii to the marble halls of Rome, we have walked through lives where crowns shone like halos, and yet pressed down like millstones. Now, standing at the end of this journey, we must ask, what is the final lesson of royal blood? The crown as a genetic cage. The Habsburgs believed marriage was strategy. Their motto, repeated for centuries, was that others might wage war, but Austria would marry. And so they did again and again, until their faces became carbon copies. Jaws yielding grotesquely, tongues thick, eyes dim. Charles II of Spain, unable to walk until 8 years old, and unable to produce an heir, did not merely represent the decline of a dynasty, he embodied it. He was a living warning, a man whose body was the battlefield, where ambition had finally met biology and lost. Queen Victoria, century later, seemed to stand as the opposite of fragility, a woman who reigned for more than 60 years, who ruled over the vast British Empire, who projected strength and permanence, and yet, hidden in her veins was hemophilia, a single mutation that travelled like a silent assassin into nearly every court of Europe. Her grandson Alexei, heir to the Russian throne, bled so easily that his mother turned to Rasputin, a mystic who became the very emblem of corruption. Thus, Victoria's legacy was not only railways and industrial power, but the slow bleeding of her descendants, literal and political, until revolutions swept away their crowns. The crown, in both Austria and Britain, was less a prize than a cage, confining rulers to choices that seemed logical at the time, but were fatal across generations. The body as a battlefield. In Egypt, the same pattern emerged centuries earlier. Tutankhamun, embalmed in gold. There was no radiant young god, but a frail teenager. His skull elongated by incest, his foot necrotic, his body ravaged by malaria, his walking sticks buried with him. Tell us more about his reign than his mask ever could. Cleopatra, his distant successor in the Ptolemaic dynasty, was remembered by Rome as a seductress of myth. Yet coin reveal a heavier farce. A hooked nose, and the weight of centuries of sibling marriages. Her body, too, was shaped by bloodlines, turned inward. And still, the myth endured. The Egyptians believed purity secured eternity. But what it secured was fragility. Children dead in infancy. Dynasties cut short. Power ceded to foreign invaders. The bodies of their rulers, twisted by generations of incest, became the battlefield where ambition met mortality. The mind as a prison. Not all cages were physical. Some were carved into the mind itself. George III of Britain, talking until foam spilled from his mouth, confined in straitjackets while his empire crumbled. Maria I of Portugal, roaming her palace, shrieking like an animal, convinced of her damnation. Elizabeth of Austria, starving herself into beauty, writing poems of despair, her son's suicide echoing her own melancholy. Ludwig of Bavaria, building castles as if they might wall off reality, found floating dead in a lake while his people whispered of madness. These rulers remind us that mental illness, too, was a legacy of dynasties that refused to breathe. Inbreeding, isolation, and pressure all wove together into fragile minds. Their palaces became prisons, where whispers of the mad king or the mad queen haunted every hallway. And when they collapsed, entire nations felt the tremors. The global echo. It would be easy to dismiss these tragedies as European peculiarities, but across the oceans, the same patterns repeated. In Hawaii, Princess Nahiena Ina was caught between two worlds, an old tradition that demanded she marry her brother to preserve mana, and a new faith that condemned her as sinful. Her infant, dead within hours, revealed the cost of generations of closed bloodlines. Her own life, ended at 21, became a symbol of a throne that caged rather than liberated. In Siam, Rama V abolished slavery, modernized hospitals, and built railways. Yet in his palace he repeated the pattern of his ancestors. Filling his harem with cousins and relatives, he presented himself in Europe with only one queen, masking the reality that his family tree was winding ever inward. A king who fought off colonial powers still found himself shackled by the cage of tradition, unable to fully free his bloodline, even as he freed his people. And in Rome, long before Hawaii or Siam, emperors like Nero and Caligula revealed the cost of dynasties that prized power over sanity. Nero, the artist who saw himself as divine, murdered his own mother and laughed while Rome burned, the Senate finally declaring him an enemy of the state. Caligula, once beloved, descended into delusion, demanding temples in his honor, humiliating senators, and reveling in grotesque cruelty. Their assassinations ended not just reigns but dynasties, proving that cages of bloodline and power consumed their occupants sooner or later. The lesson written in blood. When we gather these stories together, the jaw of Charles, the bleeding of Alexei, the cane of Tutankhamun, the howls of Maria, the wandering of Elizabeth, the drowned body of Ludwig, the broken heart of Nahir-Ina, the hidden shame of Rama, the madness of Nero, the stabbing of Caligula. One lesson rises above all others. Purity is a myth that destroys. Dynasties believed they were securing eternity by folding their family trees inward. In truth, they were guaranteeing decline. Their bodies weakened, their minds fractured, their heirs died young, their people turned against them. Crowns glittered in the torchlight. But beneath the jewels lay cages built not of gold, but of genes. Cages that no army could storm and no throne could defend. Biology is merciless. It does not bend for crowns, for palaces, or for divine claims. It demands variation, diversity, breadth. When rulers denied this, they condemned themselves. And yet, they could not see it. To them, each cousin marriage was a clever strategy. Each sibling union, a divine right. Only centuries later can we look back and see the pattern, clear as ink on parchment. Memory, myth, and warning. Even in death, these rulers could not escape their cages. Myths rewrote their stories. Tutankhamun became a golden god rather than a sickly boy. Cleopatra a seductress rather than a woman shaped by politics and genetics. Elizabeth a tragic beauty rather than an empress lost to despair. In some ways, myth was kinder than truth. But myth also hides the lesson, dressing tragedy in glamour, so that we forget the warning. Yet the lesson lingers if we choose to see it. It whispers in museum galleries, in ruined palaces, in textbooks, that power without humility devours itself, that bloodlines cannot survive without breath, that the cages we build for ourselves are always stronger than the ones imposed by enemies. The final reflection. So tonight, as we close this long journey, let us remember that the true enemy of kings and queens was not revolution, nor war, nor even betrayal. It was the illusion that blood could be perfected by confinement. The Habsburgs fell not because of Spain's enemies, but because Charles II could not produce an heir. The Romanovs fell not only because of Lenin's armies, but because Rasputin walked through the palace doors, called by the bleeding of a boy. The pharaohs lost their dynasty not to foreign gods, but to the frailty of Tutankhamun's bones. Hawaii lost its princess to a tradition that broke her heart. And Siam preserved its independence, yet left its throne tangled in incestuous unions. Rome, the eternal city, was shaken not by barbarians at the gates, but by emperors who lost their minds in cages of their own blood. Perhaps this is why their stories fascinate us still. They remind us that power does not make us invincible, that crowns do not lift us above nature. They remind us that even in palaces, human beings remain human fragile, flawed, mortal, and they warn us that when pride builds cages, when families close their doors too tightly, the echoes will last for centuries. So take a breath, let the weight of history settle in your chest, and remember the final lesson of royal blood is not glory but humility. For the mightiest thrones in the world fell not to armies, but to themselves. Now, as the echoes of history grow faint, let us dim the lanterns and close the heavy doors of the past. The stories of Charles with his jaw too heavy to speak, of Alexei bleeding quietly in the shadows of his palace, of Tutankhamun leaning on his cane, of Cleopatra cloaked in myths she never chose, of Maria screaming through the night, of Elizabeth drifting across Europe in sorrow, of Ludwig drowning in his dreams, of Nahir-Ina mourning her lost child, of Rama V hiding behind ceremony. two of Nero and Caligula lost in madness. All these voices have walked with us tonight. And yet, in the stillness that follows, we are left not with blood or crowns, but with silence. History is often told in grand strokes, wars, revolutions, the rise and fall of empires. But in the end, what lingers are not the battles won or lost, but the fragile human stories hidden beneath. A king unable to walk, a queen haunted by her own mind, a princess who could not choose her heart. These are not legends, they are lives. And their suffering reminds us that no throne, no empire, no golden mask can protect against the simple truth of being human. As you lean back now, listening in the quiet, imagine the palaces we have walked through. Once filled with light and noise, they now stand empty. Corridors echoing only with the wind. The crowns have tarnished. The thrones are vacant. But the lessons remain. Power without compassion becomes a cage. Pride without humility becomes a curse. And blood, when locked too tightly, ceases to carry life. Take a slow breath. Let it out gently. Think of how fortunate it is to live not as a king trapped in destiny, but as yourself free to love, to choose, to stumble and rise without the weight of a crown pressing on your shoulders. In that freedom lies the truest form of royalty, one that no empire can erase. Close your eyes. Let the voices of history fade into the distance, until they are no more than faint whispers, dissolving into the night. May you carry their lesson lightly, like a candle that guides, rather than a burden that crushes. And may your dreams be filled not with palaces and cages, but with open fields, fresh air, and the simple peace of being alive. Sleep well.